thank you everyone, and yeah, it's live also on Facebook now. So thank you everyone for joining for this monthly lecture series, and we also request you to kindly be participative. Whatever questions you have for the speaker, you can type them in the chat window. So it's my pleasure and privilege to welcome Mr. Devdutt Patnaik, who's the speaker for today evening's monthly lecture series. To just give you a short introduction of Sprouts, Sprouts is a environment trust. It's an NGO which works with education and awareness across the country with youth as well as adults. And one of the activities that we do is the monthly lecture series, which is our public and outreach activity that we do towards environment and nature. Uh, our monthly lecture series has been going on for 7 years now, and this is our October edition of the lecture series. We're very glad to have Mr. Devdutt Patnaik. He's a very famous writer. He's written more than 50 books and over 1,000 columns. Although he's trained as a medico, as a doctor, he's and worked in the pharma industry for over 15 years. He writes a lot on the relevance of mythology in the modern day and today's time. Many of you all might be followers of his writings and his very famous television show Devlok. Also, he's delivered a lot of TED talks, especially his Instagram henna amazing. I think that's something that a lot of you all must have heard him and been amazed about all the facts and anecdotes that he brings back from 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years of human history that is there. So I keep getting amazed with what he writes and what he talks about. And also many of the Sprouts members are amazed that what is Devdutt Patnaik doing on an environment and wildlife conservation organization's lecture series. So the relevance of that today is that he's going to be talking about the correlation between forests, human beings, the history, mythology, Aranyaka, which is the book that he's written. And we have Devdutt with us. So welcome, Devdutt, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation without absolutely any ado. And we're very happy to have you with us for this lecture. With Devdutt is also the illustrator of the book. Anita ji, thank you so much. Joining. Yeah. So Devdutt, would you like to introduce her also?
Yeah. So Amruta created this book, Amruta Patel. So today we're going to talk on this book called Aranyaka. Aranyaka is the Sanskrit word which means forest book, the book of the forest. And it was an idea that I had for a long time, but I wanted it to be a visual book. And that is the reason I contacted Amruta and said, how can we turn this into a graphic novel? Because it is a graphic novel is a very different idea. Because I had just ideas. I wanted to explain how the forest plays a very important role in Indian mythology. And then she turned it into this lovely story based on the Upanishads. And we created all characters and the whole world emerged. So really, Amruta, it's this book is created by Amruta, and you should take a look at this book. So I will tell Anand to share the link of this book with participants so that they can take a look at this book. What I'll do today is, so here's Amruta. Maybe she could say a few words about how she created the book before we go into the books in detail.
Hi, good to be on this forum with all of you. So it was a very special experience because I am a graphic novelist and we use text and image in coordination to create a graphic novel. So after many years of friendship, Devdutt approached me to work on a book where he had certain core concepts in mind and he wanted them to be written and presented in a way that was entirely different. And what came about was that we discussed with one another over multiple sessions about what the core of the book needed to be. He has for years been talking about Prakriti and the various things and how, which he will be dwelling upon later. And having had the core concepts that he wanted to discuss in place, I went about formulating a universe and a set of characters which could translate that story in a way that came more alive to people rather than it being a handbook. And we used to discuss at various stages of the way how these pages were turning out. And later, I illustrated and painted the pages to the end result that you will see in the book. So it's a very unique collaboration in that two people who write and draw were working in synchronicity, which made sense given how core the idea of darshan is to the book that is Aranyaka. Yeah.
So what I will do now is I will share, so you can see we have this lovely dog over here. It's a friend's house and it's a friend's dog who is interested in participating. Yes, 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 let me do my work. So it's our friend's house. So I will be now doing a slide share. Okay. Yes, 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 you can see. What is she doing? She's spraying me.
She's just wanting a back.
Okay. So I'm going to now share a presentation and we will take it from there. So let me just.
So Devdutt, what the general format what we follow is that we have the speaker speak and then questions are typed in the chat. I will have read them and I will moderate and ask you them one by one so that you don't have to search them out and then you can answer them as they are.
Okay. Do you mind if you just ask me a few questions? So while I'm doing this, I'll just keep answering those questions.
So there is a question already, which I can share. Two questions actually already. One is that, one second. So Shruti is asking, she's worked on Sacred Grove conservation, and in Sacred Groves, that usually there are female deities in it largely. So any particular reason behind this?
So nature is traditionally considered to be a female form in Prakriti is always visualized as a female form, and across the world. And therefore, sacred groves are always associated with the female form. So that is the way it is. So, I mean, there's no logical explanation. All traditional deities, the female form is associated with fertility and the male form is associated with protection.
Devansh has asked another question. Is that he saw you introduce your dog to everyone. And he says,
so it's not my dog, it's a
friend's dog, yeah. So he's saying, do Rigvedic and later Vedic cultures encounter the or text mention domestication of dogs anywhere?
Yeah, dogs are an important part of the rituals. So in the Rigved, Sarama is a very important character in the Rigved, where she is the female dog of Indra and helps him in finding the cows which are hidden. Now, we don't know whether this is to be taken literally or metaphorically. So Sarama is a very important character in mythology, in Rigved. In later Vedic traditions, Sarameya, or the children of Sarama, are the dogs of Yamaraj. And later these dogs are associated with Dattatreya and Bhairava. So the Bhairava, and so the dogs are always associated with Bhairava, Dattatreya, and Yamaraj. So they have slightly negative connotation because they're associated outside the village, and they were not allowed to enter the Yagyashala because they would lick all the offerings made for the gods and the dog, and therefore the priests did not like them very much. So Anand, I've sent you an email. You should be receiving it any minute now on Gmail. Yes. Just check. And
the other question is from Niharika, or it's a comment. Niharika Panchal. She says that Yaksha Swarupa used to enchant living beings using Natya Ras at Aranya.
Yes. So we have these Aranya is so in the Rigved, we don't see Aranyani is a goddess, but the forest starts becoming important in the Samaved, where there's a clear differentiation between the wild space and the cultivated space, which is called Aranya and Grama. And this differentiation between the forest space and the cultivated space is basically the difference between space in which you are in control and space you are not in control. In the forest, you are not in control. In cultivated spaces, you are in control. And that is the fundamental differences that you see in traditional Indian thought. So all traditional Indian thought begins with the Aranya, forest, and therefore Ramayana, Mahabharata, there is always reference to Vanavas, going to the forest. So you have going to the forest is a very important thing. Ram goes to the forest, Pandavas go to the forest, Nala Damayanti, they go to the forest. So going to the forest is about losing control. So you can see it not necessarily real physical space, but also psychological space where you are not in control. And that is what these stories are. So you cannot study Indian philosophy without studying nature. And you cannot, in nature, you have to study the forest, Aranya. And therefore, as I said, Ramayana, Mahabharata, Samaved, everywhere, Aranya plays a very, very important role. Going to the forest, that is where the Yakshas live, that is where the Rakshasas live, that is where the Rishis live, that is the Tapa spaces. And that is where you will encounter mysterious beings like Apsaras and Gandharvas. So it's a place with no control, and it is plays a, when the forests are in the tension between human civilization and forest is spoken of in the Mahabharata especially. By the way, Anand, have you got the slide?
Yes, it's downloading. Just in a minute we'll start that.
Okay, perfect. So what I will show you is Aranyaka and the Vedic scriptures refers to books which were meant to be rituals that were performed outside the village, which had to be performed near the forest or in secret, because like a Mahavrata Yajna and all that, yajnas which sort of reminded human beings of their wild animal nature. And the tension between being wild and domestic, because for example, in the Mahabharata, you burn a forest in order to create a city. So the whole idea of how civilization and culture is based on the destruction of forests. And to what extent will you destroy the forest to create your city is the big conversation, which is a conversation that we have even today. So, in the Ramayana, you have this dialogue between Sita and Ram, where Sita tells Ram not to hunt deer, saying that you will destroy the population. And Ram says, what else will a Kshatriya do if he doesn't go hunting deer? And the same thing happens in the Mahabharata, where the deers come in the dream of Yudhishthir and tell Yudhishthir that when you keep hunting in the forest, you kill all the population and our numbers are depleting. So can you go to another forest and you're hunting there. So there is a kind of an understanding of nature, conservation. So let me take the question on this point. In the forest, flora and fauna, humans follow which law to do their work? So in the forest, humans are just animals. It is, even if you're talking about the moment you are in the forest, you're working in the rules of the forest. There is no law in the forest. Law is a human idea of control. When you talk of law, you think of lawyers and judges. Nobody follows a law as such in the jungle. They follow the instinct and the time scale which is embedded in the natural circle. So for example, the seasons, the tides, the waxing and waning of the moon, the solstices, the equinoxes. There is no concept of property, for example, in the forest. Nothing belongs to anybody. The strongest will take over that thing. Whatever is strong will belong to you. So the notion of property is there only in human civilization. And therefore, humans carry civilization with them in their head. So it is not just that physically we create a space which is cultivated. Our mind is already cultivated. And therefore in fables, we will say things like cunning fox or loyal dog. Now, animals don't have these qualities. It is we projecting our values onto animals. And therefore we create stories where humans are, we try to give value judgments to animals, and we say things like the scorpion is not good and the lion is powerful. So we give meaning and value to different animals that creates its own problems. So snake in the Western civilization is considered evil, and you see even in a book like Harry Potter, you will have Nagini as a negative character, which sort of, or you have this Dracula associated with bats, and therefore we are mentally being told that bats are negative, or we are psychologically being influenced by these ideas that wolf is evil, sheep is good, Lord is a shepherd. So we use language of animals and birds and plants, and we therefore condition ourselves. So cows are good and pigs are not. When so these words are there embedded in our thoughts.
If that we are good to go. We are. Can everyone see the screen? I've shared the screen.
So Anand, just go to the slides. There is no. I just wanted to see the images, the story as such. Just I can't see the slides though.
Anyone can see?
No, Anand, it's dark.
Yeah, Amruta.
The screen is yet loading.
Oh, I see.
Can't
Okay.
Still
track
loading.
it.
Because it was.
Meanwhile, look at the questions that are being
Just
asked.
reshare.
Yeah.
So the story is, does Lord Shiva give his presence in Aranya? So every god has different forests. Somebody mentioned earlier about the sacred groves. Shiva is associated with Darukavana, the cedarwood forest, Devdaru. Wherever Devdar is there, they say Shiva is present. Hanuman is present in Kadalivana, which is banana forest. Ganesha is associated with Ikshuvana, which is sugarcane. The goddess is associated with Nimba or neem and tamarind. So every god is associated with plants. So in the Jain, if you read the Jain Tirthankara, every Jain Tirthankara is associated with a plant, like the jambu, the mango, acacia, sal, banyan tree, peepal tree. These are part of, even in the Harappa seals that you find, the peepal tree, you find the acacia tree, shami tree. So these trees are part of Harappa, they are part of the Jain traditions. So trees are given a lot of importance in Indian tradition. You don't find this in many traditions around the world. India has always retained plants. Every god has a plant associated with, every god has an animal associated with it. There's a landscape associated with the gods. So mountains and snow is associated with Shiva. Anand, how are we doing? No, somebody's asked me about Northeast India. I'm afraid my knowledge of Northeast India is not the best in the world. Northeast India has its own very complex traditions, and the storytelling traditions are there, but I have not got easy access to. I've been focusing more on the larger traditions of South Asia. There's a question from Prasoon about, did some Hindu gods like Shiva had a diet for non-veg? Indians have been, 80% of Indians eat non-vegetarian food. We have a long history of eating meat and deer meat and all that. It is only in recent times that vegetarianism has become political. Let's be very, very clear about it. Whether it's Buddhists or Jains or Hindus, the common man always ate or whatever was available. Remember, Indians were very poor. So you have grain, you have fruit, you have fish, you have meat, you have wild meat, you have domestic meat. So the gods are all associated with this food, whether it is Indra or, it's only nowadays it's politically sensitive, so nobody tells these things, because so the truth is established today by, not by knowledge, but by people screaming and shouting on television and the internet. Non-vegetarian is very much part of the Vedic traditions. It is also part of the Jain and Buddhist traditions. It is only the monk who would not eat meat. So other than the Shramana, Nobody. And then gradually a few Brahmins chose to be vegetarian. And over time, that became the marker of a form of Sanskritization. But otherwise, even if you look at the census report, most Indians eat chicken, they eat, like for example, in Goa right now, in Goa, there is a Vetal over here. And this Vetal is a form of Shiva. He's a guardian of the forest and it's called Nagado Vetal. It's a 7-foot statue. And the story goes that he asked the person, he was traveling the forest and the villagers wanted him to protect their village. So they said, what do you want? They said, I will protect your village. The Vetal said, if you give me sacrifice of a 2-legged animal, a 4-legged animal, a 10-legged animal, and a fetus. And so the villagers, for 2-legged animal, they gave him a rooster. For 4-legged, they gave him a goat or a buffalo. For a 10-legged animal, they gave him a crab. And for the fetus, they gave the flowers of the germinating beetle leaf, flowers of the beetle. So that was given as a fetus because it is not yet fully formed. So you see this story which is there from Nagado Vetal. When you go to Jagannath Puri temple, there is the Bimala Ma temple. And during Navratri, she is given blood sacrifice. Navratri is going on right now in Nepal, in Odisha. The goddess will be given blood. A lot of blood will be offered to her and the meat will be used by the family. So it's like Bakra Eid in Islam. There is meat being offered. When Christ feeds the hungry, he feeds them bread and fish. So the idea of eating non-vegetarian is now politicized. And being religious has nothing to do with what you eat. You eat whatever you want. I have found vegetarians also being horrible human beings, non-vegetarians also being horrible human beings. So food doesn't change it. So if somebody says by eating a particular kind of food you become, it doesn't matter. Food is food. Now, let's see the questions. Anand, what's going on? Just if you can.
His Zoom crashed, sir.
So one of the Sprouts team members are just trying to get your PPT shared.
That's okay. See, I'll just keep answering questions. Very good questions are coming meanwhile. So Prasoon, temples were controlled by Brahmins and therefore Bali is not offered in temples. In Loka Parampara, that is village festivals, tribal festivals, animals are repeatedly offered. Roosters are offered. So temples are controlled by vegetarian Brahmins and therefore you don't see blood sacrifice in most temples. Loka Parampara is always having animal sacrifices. It is all, in fact, there are more animal sacrifices in India, but since they're Loka Parampara, there's never seen on camera. It is never going to be part of major festivals. All the big temples are controlled by Brahmins who are vegetarians, who have decided God is vegetarian. It doesn't work like that. So now let me see. Why must most rishis live in the forest? Excellent question. Rishis, and that is the Aranyaka story deals with it. See, the purpose of a rishi, the word rishi comes from the word drishti, to see, in order to concentrate. You have to look at nature. So Vedas come from nature. The word for Vedas is apaurushaya, which means does not belong to humans. It is outside humans. What is outside humans? Nature. So they would watch the trees grow. They would watch the animals migrate. And they would make comments. The entire Vedic thought is around nature, nothing else. The river. So it will always begin with Mahabhuta, the elements. Whether it is clouds, whether it's the wind, whether it's water, sun, moon, stars. So then come the plants become important, then animals become important. So Charachara, they will talk about Mahabhuta Charachara. Mahabhuta is elements, Charachara is the world of animals and plants, which means zoology and botany. So you find this great attention given to plants, animals, minerals. And rishis are doing this because, you see, when you start observing nature, you realize what is the difference between a living organism and a non-living thing, which means what is the difference between physics and biology? Physics, there's a world of physics and the world of biology. The world of biology there's only one principle which separates the biological world from the physical world. And you find this in the Taittiriya Upanishad. The Taittiriya Upanishad, they will say the only thing which separates animals and plants from elements is hunger. Bhuka. We are hungry. We are hungry constantly. And because we are hungry constantly, the plants are hungry, therefore they have green leaves looking towards the sun. They have roots going towards water. That is why they are hungry. They want food, bhog. Animals are looking for grass. The tiger is looking for a prey. So all animals are looking for food. So anna is what defines nature. And this understanding of the rishis comes by observing nature. So rishis were therefore tapovana. To do tapa is to look at nature and to understand how am I separate from nature. I am also looking for food. I am also seeking shelter. I am seeking protection. I am as nervous as the deer. I am as restless as, so when they would see the sun, they would say, I am radiant like the sun. I am moody like the moon. I am mercurial like Mercury. I am, how things change over time. Fortune and misfortune comes and goes like the seasons. So they looked at nature to understand life. So that is why rishis are very strongly associated with, oh good, finally we got the images. So Anand, just go through the slides because I won't be able to change them. And this is Aranyani. This is the heroine of our story called Katyayani. As you can, she's associated with the forest. Can you see that? Can we see the next slide? Anand. So we want to talk, remember I talked about hunger and appetite. And hunger and appetite, next please. So we see these slides and you will see we are focusing about this girl who is talking about food again. Should I eat or should the stone statue eat? She's asking this very fundamental question. The stone is a stone. It's a stone. Why do I feed a stone when I am hungry? And the difference between a rock and a human being is hunger. And that is what the story is about. And why do you give offerings to statues and gods is to remind you of hunger, which is the fundamental governing principle of living organisms, plants and animals. And that is how if you don't discuss hunger, how do we discuss hunger in day-to-day life? We discuss hunger by using words like, need and want and greed and ambition, but they're all hunger. It's just hunger. The plants are hungry, the animals are hungry, but human hunger is very different. Human hunger has no expiry date. Human hunger has no limits. We have insatiable hunger. So this is what the story is about. Next slide, please. Expiry date. Human hunger. Okay. So now look at this image. This is talking about the goddess producing food. So here you have the image of, you can see the papaya over there. You can see the images of holding the goddesses are associated with parrots. This is a goddess holding a parrot. She has got a sugarcane in her hand. These are symbols of love and desire. So it is also showing that nature is not just about hunger, it is also because we eat in order to stay alive, but we know that we will not live forever. And therefore nature creates a reproduction cycle in order to outwit death. So reproduction is represented by Kamadeva, and Kamadeva is always shown holding a sugarcane bow and a parrot. So these are symbols of reproduction. So the goddesses, so you're seeing this goddess over here, she's holding, this is Andal, this is a very famous saint, poet saint from South India. The same image is here of Katyayani has it. Next slide, please. And you are seeing this Annapurna, the idea of the goddess. So you have Rati, the goddess of desire, the goddess of love. There's another kind of hunger. So that is a physical or sexual desire. There is also the appetite. So Annapurna, who feeds, who cooks food. How do you cook food? You cannot, humans are the only creature who cook food. We turn fire, and with fire, the moment humans conquered fire, we conquered nature. That is the big thing. The birth of, so Yajna, the first Yajna is the kitchen. It is in the kitchen. I put food inside and it came out in edible format. So I gave Naivedya to Agni and it came out as Prasad. So I put a root or a branch or a fruit and it transforms in fire. So humans, fire plays an important role in the kitchen, and therefore you see the Vedas keep talking about fire, fire, fire all the time. Next slide, please. You'll see these questions over here in the book, which keeps on, who are you feeding? What are you feeding? Are you feeding the body? Are you feeding your ego? What are you feeding? And these are the questions you find. These are all lines from the Vedas, by the way. None of them are, Amruta hunted these lines and we pulled them out from various Vedas. And we're talking about someone who says that I don't want to be part of nature. This is talking about the famous tapasyas who sit, they say now Valmiki sat and the whole termite hill came over him, which means he was so normally when we look, if somebody pinches us, we will react very badly. But a rishi would control himself to the point where he would also control his desires to the point that he would not be hurt. Even if a termite hill is formed on his body, he would not move. That is how he detached himself from nature. And here is Katyayani trying to get him back. So this is like an Apsara saying that come back into the world. And so all these are metaphors in the Vedas. Forest, termite hill. What does a termite hill represent? It represents the world of desires and connections. And the rishi who is saying that I want to control these desires. And therefore I will not be stirred or enchanted by nature. So much so that even if an ant walks on my body, nothing happens to me. If a snake walks on my body, nothing happens to me. Even if termites walk on my body, nothing happens to me. I don't reject them. I don't shun them. And I don't push them away. If a cockroach were to walk on your body, you will shove them away. But here, the symbol is of a sage who says that I'll be part of nature. So he has now become like a rock, which is impervious to pain, impervious to hunger. So he's trying to conquer hunger. He's trying to conquer pain. And that is how the stories were told. Next slide, please. But human beings love food and our connection with nature and our destruction of nature happens because we have appetite. The day our appetite goes away, we will not destroy nature. And this is our hunger for food is at the heart of all environmental activities. Because how much food do you need? Do you need one fist of food? You look at the chicken over there, it has been domesticated. Why has it been domesticated? So that it will give us eggs, so that it will give us protein, it will be used for cooking food. So domestication, human culture comes from our need for food and to create additional resources. More food we have, the more time I have to sit down and dream about stars, about poetry. And therefore, human beings cultivated. We started creating farms and orchards and kitchens so that we could have more time to do other things other than foraging and hunting. Next slide, please. And the tension between how much food, look at the two plates over there. This is the two people fighting over how much food do we need. This is today, you could see this conversation as a conversation between people who say that we don't need to eat so much. Some people saying that the more, it's our greed which is destroying nature. The other is saying that, but nature is providing us with abundance. Why should we not enjoy the abundance of nature? All the various abundance of nature. How much should we take? Should we indulge our appetite or should we outgrow our appetite? So one school of thought says life is about enjoying and satisfying our desires. The other school of thought says it is about destroying our desires. So all the tapasvis are in one direction. So the yogis and the yoginis belong to two different schools of thought. The yogis said the whole purpose of life is not to have desires, to destroy hunger. The yogini says, no, the purpose of life is to enjoy our desires but not to hoard, to enjoy its coming and going. So there are these two schools of thought that emerge in India, and that is this image is displaying that. Next slide, please. this is not really related to Aranya, but it talks about, many a times I use the male and female forms are used in nature, but are male and female forms seen as equal? People say equal, and this is the tension. One equality is I'm the left side and you are the right side. The other is to say that you are above and I am below. So there's always been tension between yogis and yoginis, where your conversation is the yogini equal to the yogi, or is the yogini inferior to the yogi? And the whole idea is, what is the purpose of life? Is it to indulge our appetite, or is it to outgrow our appetite? What is superior? What is superior? Is the rishi superior because he says, I want to outgrow my appetite and my hunger? Or is the yogini superior because she says, no, we have to indulge. The whole purpose of life is to indulge our appetite. So these are the Vedic and the Tantric schools, really. The Vedic school said, ये जो भूख है हमारे भीतर, इसको मिटाना चाहिए. And the Tantric school said, नहीं, इसको आप भोग लेना चाहिए. So yoga and bhog are the two concepts, and define our relationship with nature. What should our relationship with nature be? So I will end the presentation till here because it gets too heavy after this. We don't need to see the entire presentation because the rest of it is not required. I just wanted to share with you that how the forest, this whole book talks about the forest, and share it with your friends, because without understanding nature, you cannot understand Indian philosophy. Indian philosophy is only about nature. That is why Shiva is associated with a bull, Ganesha is associated with a rat. As I said, every god is associated with an animal, a plant, a mineral. It is even in Jainism, you will find this. You have every animal, every Tirthankara is associated with a plant, every Tirthankara is associated with an animal. Why is that? Mahavir is associated with a plant and an animal. So this importance given to plants and animals is very important. All the old Gurudwaras were based around around trees. Now you don't find the trees, you only find marble structures. So it tells you a lot. The old structures were all organic. The old Vedashalas were all organic. They were not meant, you're not allowed to make it permanent. In fact, stone was not allowed in India. They were always using wood and organic stuff because things have to die a natural death. So we can get rid of this presentation, Anand, if somebody can stop the presentation.
Rahul, can you stop presenting? Yeah.
So that's the purpose, I thought, today in the talk is to show how the book is also trying to highlight how nature is a critical component of Vedic thought. You don't find this in many other cultures. In Chinese culture, you do find it. In Chinese culture talks a lot about culture. You don't find this in the biblical traditions too much. You don't find this much in the Quranic traditions too much. Chinese traditions talks about it. Tribal traditions talk about it. Polytheistic traditions talk about it. Pagan traditions talk about it. Where nature is a very integral part of life. So these are, this was just my presentation, my ideas. If you have questions, we can answer them. I think there are a lot of questions that I'm seeing over here.
Yeah. So which was the last one you had answered was? So I can then guide you through. I think that was about...
there are, for example, I think it is Adesh Guhan who had asked about why rishis live in forest.
Forest, yeah, okay.
Somebody said about mountain. When you say forest, it doesn't mean forest as in jungle. It means all uninhabited spaces. It could be a desert. It could mean wild mountains. It could mean the sea. Anything which is not under human control is called Aranya, wilderness, the wild space, not the cultivated space. So anything which is not controlled by humans is called Aranya. It is not forest as in jungle.
So Devdutt, I have a question.
Food history. Yeah, sure.
Okay. So typically we've seen in some the mythologies that going into the forest was considered as a punishment, or being banished into the forest. One of course being the benefits and comforts of the kingdom, or more luxurious life. Whereas now in modern day, people consider going into the forest to be the luxurious kind of thing. So how do you compare these two things? Like today we say I'm going for like my whole life has been about venturing into the forest, and it's considered to be a pleasurable activity. So how is this dichotomy, or why is it sort of different in that kind of manner?
See, today I have the option to come. We have a lot of luxuries
Right.
in the city life, and going to the forest is an escape from the pressure and the tension of city life.
Right.
Because the city life has become not about comfort, it has become about pressure, stress, pollution, and therefore we go to the forest. In the old days, the forest was something that people would remember. There's no electricity. You're in the middle of the forest. All kinds of creepy crawlies are there. Protecting you is fire. Nothing else is really protecting you, and you have got all kinds of insects and so living in the forest was very difficult. Survival in the forest was very difficult. Today, when we travel, we have a knapsack, we have a place to sleep. We are talking about people who had nothing. They would just walk around with, even for collecting water, they would collect in their hand. And you would eat, you had to compete with the monkeys for the fruits. There was no dhaba out there to keep food for you. You couldn't carry atta with you. In fact, the rishis were not allowed to carry food with them. That was the purpose of thing. You keep walking. If you get food, you eat. If you don't get food, you don't eat. And your hoarding was not allowed. So you're not allowed to collect food and say, okay, I'll carry 3 fruits on the journey. They were not allowed to do that. So when we are talking about the old days and the forest, we're talking about very different times. Today, it's even in the old days, really going to the Uppavana or the orchard was also a holiday. So they also went on the, going and doing riding with their servants and the cooks, and everybody would go to the forest. But that is not really going into the forest. That is only enjoying the forest as if you're going to a theater.
Okay, thanks. So the next one was in all the Vedas there is importance about environment. That's why human civilization near forest or rivers is that, like, in the Vedas there is a lot of importance given to the environment. Is that the reason that civilization was near forests and rivers?
Civilization is near forest and rivers. In order to survive, you need access to water. So that is always going to be there. You also need food, and therefore you need fertile land. Now, which is fertile land? It will be deltas, it will be river valleys. You won't choose to go to the desert. So who goes to the desert? Who don't have access to because those who would create the villages near the water supply areas would control that land and not let anybody else come in. So gradually people will go to unfertile lands. You will go to the deserts, and therefore those who lived in fertile lands were always under threat of attacks by people who lived in unfertile lands. So that is the nature of civilization. You'll always go where there is a lot of food. Now we don't think about the world in these terms. Now we think of the world in very different ways. But in the old days, where there is water, there is civilization. There is culture. So all the big temples in India, they're always near rivers. Look at all the big temples in India. They're always near rivers, farms. You don't find them in the middle of deserts. And if they're in the middle of desert, they would be next to an oasis. So for example, Mecca in the desert is associated with Zamzam water. So it is not outside a water supply source. So if there was no Zamzam water, there wouldn't be the whole point of Mecca is really coming from the idea of the Zamzam water. So it is a source of water. So that is what makes it special. Otherwise, it wouldn't be important.
So there's another, next question is by Adyasha Nayak. He's saying, referring to an earlier question about animalistic cultures attributing a female aspect to nature, we see a balance of male or female. What is the time frame, according to you, of the Sanskritization of such cultures?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you clearly.
Okay. So there was an earlier reference to animalistic cultures where a female form is attributed to it. And there's a balance between male and female over there. According to you, what is the time frame when cultures got Sanskritized? such cultures, animalistic cultures?
So they start roughly from 2,500 years ago, the Sanskritization. See, first Buddhism comes and Jainism comes and tries to, the tribal communities are first exposed to Buddhism and Jainism. That is why you find animals and plants even in Buddhism and Jainism. And then the Brahminization, they all happen simultaneously from roughly the time of the Buddha, so 2,500 years ago. You find these ideas spreading. Again, they spread along river valleys initially and then gradually go into the wild forests. Originally, all these influences, wherever there were river valleys. So that is where the central control was. And then gradually they move out and they start spreading into this thing. So in the last 2,500 years ago, you'll find this if all religions, for example, Islam becomes most popular in river valleys. In Bangladesh, when it starts in the 16th century because the river changed course. Ganga changed its course in the 16th century around the Mughal period. And the new areas which were cultivated were inhabited by Ghazis and Sufis in Bangladesh. And that is why you find Islam as a very strong population in the river deltas of Bangladesh. So while most parts of India had about 10% of Muslim population, Bangladesh had over 50-60% of population. So again, it is related to agriculture. The same thing happens in the region of Punjab. The Indus Valley civilization changes its course, and that particular area in the 16th and 17th century becomes open to agriculture, and that is where the Ghazis and Sufis come. So you find the local tribal people being converted to Islam in this way. So you find in some places Brahminization takes place, in some places Islamicization takes place. It is always in these rich areas that you will find these religions spreading. They always go towards wherever there is river valleys, and so it's always there. But so that's how you stand. So it's not just Sanskritization, it's all religions, you'll find it.
Samir Inamdar is asking that rishis go to the mountains, including the Kailash. So what's your take on it? Why mountains?
Well, mountains have always been associated with wisdom. So it is looking at the world from a higher perspective. It's more a metaphor. It's not a real thing that people went to mountains. It is more a metaphorical idea of rising and seeing a 360-degree view of things. So if you look at Jain they'll always say that the Jain Tirthankara sits on top of a mountain and gives lectures to all creatures around him who are at the bottom end of the mountain. So mountain becomes a metaphor of someone who can see the world from a different perspective. It has not to be taken literally. Because remember, if the mountain has no food, you say Kailas, if I drop you in Kailas, you will die of starvation. Unless you have, where do you get food from? Because there's nothing growing on Mount Kailas. You have to carry food from base camp and go towards Mount Kailas, wherever it is. So it is all very romantic to Shivji वो पहाड़ के ऊपर बैठे हैं, but खाते क्या हैं? खाना कहाँ से आता है? So you need access to food. So unless there is food, that's why all the rishis would travel from one water source to another water source. All the things, all the pilgrim spots are related to water kund. जहाँ पानी का कुंड होगा, वहीं पे तीर्थ यात्रा होती है. In fact, the word tirtha, what does it mean? Water. So if there is no water, there is no tirth. Remember, Mecca is also associated with Zamzam water. We have about 10 minutes, then we'll have to wind up.
Yeah.
Anand.
Right. So there's one more question which I don't know whether you already answered that. Why gods and goddesses have animals as their associations with them?
So humans saw animals before we started making statues of gods and goddesses. We always saw gods in plants, animals, and rocks, rivers, mountains. And gradually we started anthropomorphizing them. So the act of turning them into human forms only begins about 2000 years ago. Before 2000 years ago, we would only worship gods in the form of plants. So instead of worship, Shiva would be worshipped as a rock and the Bilva tree and the Nandi bull. Ganesha would be worshipped in the form of sugarcane, would be worshipped in the form of haldi, would be worshipped in the form of coconut. So you don't, these gods, abhi jo forms we see are very recent phenomena. Well, not recent, but 2000 years ago. Before 2000, we never used these images.
Uh, then there was another one. Purposes of yaksha in forests in Indian mythology.
So yakshas and rakshasas represent wild forest creatures that people encountered. So also metaphorically, yaksha and rakshasas were creatures who do not involve in transactions. So they don't get involved in transactions, in business exchange. They grab. So the sign of civilization was when you trade, when you give and take things. So foragers and hunters would not do that. And gradually, if you even see civilization happening, it happens when melas start to happen, where people are exchanging things. So that is where, when you start practicing that, then you move out of being rakshasas and yakshas. So in Buddhist traditions also, you will have stories of Buddha traveling to Sri Lanka and then destroying the yakshas in Sri Lanka and replacing them with Buddhists.
So I have a question before we go to the next question. Is that since there is a lot of mixing of cultures that has happened, we've had Tibetan culture coming in, so Buddhism, has come in. Now the snow leopard, for example, in many of the monasteries we see the mouse and the elephant and the leopard, the snow leopard, chinthe, whatever is represented. Now how do elephants and snow leopards do these two cultures, are there similarities or have they blended in some of the border areas? How do the mythologies combine?
So they change over time. Some things change, some things don't change. For example, look at the city of Singapore.
Okay.
Singapore is named after Singapura, lion city. There were never any lions in Malaysia.
Correct.
And yet the city of Singapore is called the city of lions. Or you go to Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka's flag has a lion on it, but there were never any lions in Sri Lanka. You can talk to any natural historian, they will say there were never any lions.
Yeah.
But the lion was the symbol of a king. It comes from ancient Egypt, Persia. So the kings were associated with lions, and that idea became very popular. Even in China, the king started seeing him as a lion. So the symbol goes everywhere of lion. But some places, the lion symbol start getting adapted and changed. So you sign and adapting based on local needs. So then the snow leopard comes in, the snow lion comes in, because the people start seeing local animals and they try to mix and match these things. So we have to understand the symbol. Some symbols change, some symbols don't change.
Also, like for example, we do have fossils or fossil evidence of things that are there, of animals that are there. Now I'm sure fossils were there in the mythology, in when the time the Vedas were written, etc. Are there references to fossils or other things or animals or the forms of animals, and they having sort of referred to something like that?
Shaligram that everybody worships is an ammonite fossil.
Fossil, yeah.
It's a fossil, but I don't think anybody knew they were fossils. They just saw rocks with special designs on it found on riverbeds.
Right.
And they would say, yeah, this became the symbol of Vishnu. So Shaligram stone, which is so important in the Vaishnava cultures, is actually a fossil. But knowledge of fossils was not there. Knowledge of fossils.
There was no theorized. Nobody has theorized that there could be what you call, similarly as there is the whole lineal or hereditary or whatever. They did not think that there were creatures in the past which have.
No. There's no understanding of dinosaurs and all that. That's okay. If somebody says it's pseudoscience, but it's not there.
No. There were a few other questions I'll take before. So, can you share more about goddess Aranyani? Are there temples of her?
No. Vedic period had no temple. So, therefore, the Vedic gods are not associated with temples. Aranyani is a goddess mentioned, as I said, in Rig Veda. You can Google her. Just Google Aranyani. You'll get one song. There's only one. There are 1,000 poetries in the Rig Veda. One of them is dedicated to Aranyani. She's not an important goddess, but is an awareness of the goddess who is not cultivated. So this, I said, the very important Vedic concept is the wild and the cultivated. This separation is a very important Vedic concept. So Aranyani comes from there. So that tradition. We'll answer one more question and then we'll have to wind up, please.
Right. Yeah. Is there any description of forest and environment in Devi Mahatmya?
Mahatmya. No,
Mahatmya.
there isn't. The goddess, the forest is a very general term used as metaphor. The earliest descriptions of forest come from Tamil poetry. They come from Sangam poetry. So Sangam poetry plays a very important role in forests. And then later you have descriptions of forest, for example, in Ramayana, and then you have in Mahabharata, then you have these descriptions of forest. But they're more at a metaphorical and poetic level. They are not to be taken very literally, but there are a lot of, for example, in the Rig Veda, you have certain plants, and all the plants referred in the Rig Veda come from the Indian subcontinent. So the acacia, the bamboo, munja, kusha, dhruva, yava or barley. There is no rice mentioned in Rig Veda. So when you read these crates, you get an understanding of natural history very beautifully. You find different kinds, like for example, Harappa has certain things, Rig Veda has certain things, the Kavya literature is very different. Sangam poetry talks about forests, different kinds of forests, dry forests, wet forests, deciduous forests, evergreen forests. So there's a lot of awareness of nature, but not in the scientific way, the way we discuss it today, more at a poetic and descriptive level.
I have another question, is that there's a lot of talk on the terrestrial forms that are there. I'm sure people used to go into the sea and they used to fish. So whales or porpoises, dolphins, do they get mentioned in mythological stories or?
Sorry.
I said whales, dolphins, etc. Do they get mentioned in mythological stories?
Dolphin is there. It's called Timmi.
Okay.
The river, freshriver dolphin. Freshriver dolphin is there.
Right.
Ganga is associated with the freshriver dolphin.
Okay.
Whales are associated with Varuna. But they use words like Timmi, so you really don't know which animal they were talking about. Was it the shark? Was it the dolphin? Was it the whale? You're not 100% sure. In Bible, the Jonah and the whale plays a very important role in the story of Jonah. He's trapped in the stomach of a whale for a very long time. So you do have this story of Jonah. You do have these things.
Okay, Shefali has asked one question that could be probably the last question for the evening. And I don't know whether this is true. Why the West does not have these types of cultures as the East? Is that true, first and foremost?
So, first of all, West has a lot. Please remember what happens is when you see Western tradition, you have to differentiate the pagan and the monotheistic cultures. When monotheism came in, please remember when you have the biblical traditions and the Quranic traditions and the Old Testament and the New Testament, when these traditions became very powerful, all the tribal traditions went away, which had a lot of animal importance. So the pagan traditions gave a lot of importance to animals and plants. In the Bible, humans are seen as superior to plants and animals. And therefore, animals and plants play a role only from a metaphorical point of view. We don't see a lot of discussions on rivers, trees. Like in the Greek mythology, the rivers were gods, trees were gods, animals were gods. This is not seen later in the biblical traditions, in the Quranic traditions, where it starts reducing lower and lower and lower. Also remember the Christianity and Islam was in a very relatively desert areas. So compared to the amount of plants and animals that we talk in Hinduism or China, if you go to China, you go to Japan, you will see the traditions where plants, animals get a lot of it. The Shinto traditions talk a lot about plants and animals. So all pagan cultures talk about plants, animals, rocks, minerals. They lose their importance as we become more and more monotheistic. So monotheism somehow is uncomfortable with plants and animals.
So is Bon Bibi of the Sundarbans, for example, is that a modern creation or has it been established for a long time?
She's a forest goddess. She's Bon Bibi, forest goddess. But then over time when Islam came in, when you read the story of Bon Bibi and the king, the sultan of the jungles and the 18 tides and all the
Yeah.
stories. They are stories where Islam is trying to combine with the local cultures. And the Islam over there is very different from the Islam in Arabian lands. There's a
Right.
new Islam which is emerging where you are connecting with nature and you're worshipping tiger and God is taking the form of a tiger. So all those stories, you can see the Hindu influence in these stories, or not even the tribal influences in the story. In a Wahhabi Islamics will get very upset if you tell them that born baby is worshipped by the local Muslims in Bangladesh. They will die. They will not accept it at all. So these are local tradition. Loka parampara is always linked to trees, animals, plants. That is Loka parampara. It's always Loka parampara. So you'll find them in temples in India. Hinduism is in the borderline of has a lot of pagan elements there. We never expunged the pagan side. Pagan means jungle, jungly, animal, nature, that kind of things. Okay? We'll have
Thank
to
you
wind up.
so much, Devdutt, and please keep writing a little more and lots more on nature and on wildlife, and
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 do read
please,
this book.
yes, I've shared the link of the. I'm again sharing the link of where to buy the book. Please buy the book, and please join us for our next lecture series. Also, it will be put up on our trust page. Thank you, Devdutt. Once again, a very enriching talk. Everybody really enjoyed it, and lots of new ideas have come into the mind to discuss with you. So thanks so much, and have a good evening, and see you soon. So thanks everyone for joining in for today evening's talk. And we have this talk once a month, usually second or fourth Saturday. Please look up our page, and we also have online courses which are available. Please follow us on Sprouts Environment Trust on our Facebook page, or on Instagram also by the same handle @Sprouts Environment Trust. We have a lot of biodiversity related. The next one will also be probably a book author, and it will be announced very soon. So thank you for joining in, and have a great evening. Thanks again, Devdutt, and thanks, Dviti. You keep helping us with the presentation. Mahesh, Samant, my team, Amruta, Rahul, Sneha, Siddharth. Thank you for handling all the back end things, as well as just one request that if there are ideas that you have as to what kinds of other lectures that you want to attend and listen to, we are trying to bring in other aspects. This time we got you aspects of mythology and religion, or related with wildlife and nature. We do have a lot of scientific talks also that are there. Next time we're trying to see if we can do art and nature. So we'll try to combine, so that there are many ways that we can approach it. There could be music and nature also that can be approached. So we will definitely get you all these different kinds of talks. So thank you everyone, and have a great evening. See you soon.